Welcome, everybody, to the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. I'm Matt Jacobs. I'm the new director here at the Bob Graham Center. I've been here for a little over a month now. As I said, I want to welcome you all here, and especially I want to welcome you all here on a night that's so important to our own democracy. The Gainesville city elections are happening today, and so obviously that's a really important moment for us. Before I introduce the speaker, I want to talk for just a minute or two about what the Bob Graham Center does and where it might be heading in the coming years here. So the Bob Graham Center has been around since 2006, named for our former governor and senator, Bob Graham, obviously. Historically, it has focused on three driving principles: civic engagement, public leadership, and public service, and equipping our students as future leaders in the state of Florida to engage in those ways and help them develop the skill sets necessary to successfully engage, serve, and lead in their lives after college, and obviously while they're here on campus in Gainesville as well. Moving forward, we want to build on that strong foundation that we've built over the last 12 years and maintain those initiatives, while we also want to think about some of the next challenges that Florida's facing. And I would argue that moving forward, Florida's challenges are the world's challenges. So if you think, just with some examples here, 1 in 3 jobs in the state of Florida are connected globally. 40% of all U.S. trade with Latin America goes through the state of Florida. If you think about Miami, it's effectively become a cultural and political capital of the Americas. If you think about climate change, sea level rise will impact the state of Florida more than any other state in the country moving forward. So Florida's challenges are the world's challenges. And if we want to prepare our students for the future as leaders, as employers, as employees, as citizens, as public servants, we need to help them, you, I see many students here, learn the skills necessary to connect local to global and global to local, whether we're talking about impacts, challenges, or solutions, okay? So that's some of what the Graham Center is going to be working on in the coming years as we seek to expand its footprint on campus and off, locally, across the state, in Washington, D.C., and indeed internationally as well. So I want to welcome you. I hope you will join us as we move through these sorts of issues going forward, as we seek to broaden our impact in all of these different ways. We welcome you. The Graham Center is a wonderful place. And we hope that we'll see more of you here engaging in all kinds of different ways, okay? So let me turn to introducing our speaker, and for this I actually need some notes here. So first we need to thank our sponsors, our co-sponsors, the Elizabeth B. and William F. Poe Center, Senior Business Ethics Center and U.S. Warrington College of Business. Sorry, I butchered that one a little bit. And the Hugh Cunningham Fund for Journalism Excellence in the College of Journalism and Communications. Tonight's speaker, Jesse Eisinger, really embodies journalism excellence. In 2011, he and a colleague won a Pulitzer Prize for their work for ProPublica, reporting on some of the nefarious or questionable business practices and financial practices of some of the leaders in Wall Street that helped make that crisis one of the worst since the Great Depression. We have invited him here because we're on roughly the 10th anniversary of that crisis, and its impact on Florida was enormous. Florida was one of the most deeply impacted states in the country by that financial crisis. And so this gives us a moment to reflect a little bit on what that impact was, and Jesse will help us do that. In 2017, he published The Chickenshit Club, Why the Justice Department Fails to Prosecute Executives. And he's going to be speaking about that book tonight. I will also note it is on sale over here, and he'll be able to sign some copies later on, if you wish, after the talk. The Washington Post called it, quote, an important and profound book that takes no prisoners. And since publishing that, Jesse has continued to investigate the influence of the wealthy and well-connected on federal agencies, including a series co-published in The Atlantic that found billions in uncollected and unpursued taxes. And he's also done some reporting on some of the current scandals reflecting with the IRS in terms of Paul Manafort, Michael Cohen, and so on. So there's some good reading to be done there as well. Jesse's work has also appeared in the New York Times, NewYorker.com, the Washington Post, the American Prospect, on NPR, and on This American Life. Before joining ProPublica, he was a Wall Street editor of Condé Nast Portfolio and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal covering markets and finance. He joins us from Brooklyn, where he lives with his wife, the journalist Sarah Ellison, and their 2 daughters. Please join me in welcoming Jesse Eisinger.
Thank you so much. I've got a mic, yeah. Thank you so much, Matthew, for that kind introduction. I'm very happy to be in Florida where, not only were you devastated by the financial crisis, but there's so much accomplishment in white-collar crime in this state. So I feel like a particular, yes, almost number one. I mean, you've got a lot of competition. We've got Long Island in New York. And of course, we have Wall Street, the capital of white-collar crime. So, but Florida's a good second, I think. So anyway, yeah, I'll talk a little bit about my book, and I can talk about ProPublica, and then kind of open it up for questions. Thank you very much, the Graham Center, for inviting me, and Cynthia for shepherding me around. So in 2002, a guy named Jim Comey, anybody rings a bell? He joins he becomes the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, which is in the southern tip of Manhattan. And the Southern District is the best office in the Department of Justice, the most prestigious, the most serious, they're the best prosecutors. And the way you know this is you ask a alumna of the Southern District, and they'll tell you, yes, the Southern District is the very best office of the DOJ. And Comey comes in to be U.S. Attorney, and he gathers all the criminal prosecutors together in a room. And these guys are the brightest of the bright, the best of the best. They've gone to the best high schools to presumably not cheat to get into the best colleges, to get into the best law schools, to get the best clerkships, to get this position as a prosecutor for the federal government. And he gathers them all together, and he says, but I'm going to give some remarks. And what this is it's a monthly meeting where you go in, you give the box score of who won the trial, what trials there were in the past month, and who won and who ran the trials. And so he says, before we give the box score, I want to make a few remarks. How many of you guys have never lost a case? So all these bright young things sitting in a room, a bunch of hands shoot up. Never lost a case, very proud. He says, so my buddies and I have a name for you guys. You're the Chickenshit Club. And hands go down. These guys don't slump in their chairs very often. They're not slumpers. They're not backseat of the room guys. So now they're feeling a little bit shy, and he goes on to explain what he means. And what he means is that being a prosecutor is not about winning. It's certainly not about winning at all costs. And it's not about accumulating an undefeated record. Being a prosecutor is about doing justice. And Comey's point is that justice requires taking on ambitious cases. Justice requires not being afraid of losing. You can sometimes do justice and lose your case. Juries are mercurial, they're unpredictable. Justice requires taking on the most important wrongdoers in issues in American society. And what's happened, in my argument, is that the Justice Department writ large has become the Chickenshit Club. We do not know today how to take on the most ambitious wrongdoers. We have failed to take on white-collar criminals, the powerful, the wealthy. And in fact, I argue that we've lost the will and skill set to take on corporate executives. And I sort of want to walk through a very mini history of American jurisprudence in the 20th century to understand sort of how we got this way. And as most of you know, there was a crash in 1929. My daughter is running in her 5th grade class a stock market experiment, and so they're buying stocks. And she came and said, "I'm buying Cadillac, and I'm buying RCA." And I was like, "Well, what are you talking about? Cadillac, RCA, those aren't stocks." She said, "Well, no, we're studying the 20s, and we're all buying stocks, and I'm 100% in the stock market." And I said, "I don't know if I should do a spoiler here, but or whether you're going to learn a very important lesson." I said, by the end, I said, I'll just hold this back. So, of course, what she doesn't know is that in 1929, there's a huge crash. Over the next decade, we essentially create white-collar crime. Now, what I mean by that is not that, that it existed, obviously, embezzlement existed, things like that, but there are whole swaths of activity that are perfectly legal in 1929 that we make illegal after the crash. We create the entire architecture of white-collar enforcement, create the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the 1933 Act, the 1934 Act, the 1940 Investment Act, and we define what manipulating securities is. It was legal to short, if you're the CEO, to short the stock of your own company in 1929. And a lot of people did and made a lot of money. It was legal to create stock manipulation pools and spread rumors and drive stocks up. We made that illegal. So there's boom, there's bust, there's crackdown. And then, skipping very quickly forward, there's the savings and loan crisis, which hits states like Texas in particular, but Florida in the late 1980s. Over 1,000 individuals are prosecuted in the wake of the S&L crisis. They're around the same time as a junk bond boom in American finance, and federal prosecutors prosecute arguably the most powerful person on Wall Street at the time, Michael Milken, but not just Michael Milken. He's not the only one. They prosecute dozens of other people, lawyers, accountants, major Wall Street figures. They frog march a Goldman Sachs partner off the trading floor in handcuffs. That's Rudy Giuliani at the time. It's a serious crackdown. After the NASDAQ bubble burst, the tech bubble burst, which is really a stock market bubble, in the late 1990s, they prosecuted almost all the top executives from almost all the companies that were implicated in the accounting fraud pandemic that we saw. There was WorldCom, Adelphia, Tyco, Global Crossing. A lot of these names are lost to history. The one that might not be lost to history even for the kids in college here is Enron. But there were almost all of those top executives, CEOs, chairmen, and they were all men, were prosecuted in the wake of that. After the financial crisis that hits in 2008, there's almost nothing. There's one mid-level banker who's prosecuted for activities related to the financial crisis, to the creation of the financial crisis and its aftermath. Only one. And this really troubled me. I had exposed some of the bad behavior from the Wall Street banks. I was far from the only one. Many of my colleagues had exposed bad behavior, and we sat around waiting for the prosecutions, waiting for the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Department of Justice to bring justice, to have a reckoning, to have an accountability, and there was none. And I could not understand why, and that's why I was driven to write the book, to try to understand what was going on. And what I have realized is that we have a serious problem on our hands. We have a white-collar prosecution crisis. And I want to give you a few facts just to ground the discussion. In the early 1990s, which is when the Department of Justice first started keeping track of its statistics on white-collar prosecutions and what kinds of prosecutions it did, 1 in 5 cases, 20% of the cases were white-collar. Their definitions are a little squishy, but that's a kind of a benchmark. Today, it's well under 10%. So it's fallen dramatically. The number of individuals prosecuted reached an all-time low in January. It's fallen well over 50% since the early 2000s. So we don't really prosecute individuals anymore. And that overstates things because not only do they not really prosecute individuals, but they especially don't prosecute the really powerful individuals, the CEOs, the COOs, the CFOs. In fact, I can think of only one CEO of a Fortune 500 company, a guy named Aubrey McClendon at Chesapeake, who was indicted in the last in 11 years. I date that from the financial crisis. So 11 years gone by, all those many thousands of men and women in those positions, and one guy committed a crime that the Department of Justice determined was indictable. Unfortunately for Justice and for Aubrey, he drove his car into a wall and died before he went to trial. So we don't know if he was going to be convicted. Corporate convictions, I thought that was going to be a laugh line, but I guess not. I guess driving, that's too dark. That's a laugh line in New York, but Florida people are nicer. Corporate convictions are down 30% in the last decade. So we don't convict corporations either. So what do we do? What we do is we settle for corporations with money. I'll give you one example of the office in Silicon Valley. No crime there, right? No problems. White-collar cases in the Northern District of California in 1995 were 354. It was 72 in 2018. It used to be 2.5% of all the white-collar cases in the country. Now it's down to 1%. So stock option backdating, to privacy violations, to manipulation of the stock from Tesla, to Uber's excesses. Those things are not prosecuted as in white-collar crime. In Theranos, Elizabeth Holmes was indicted years ago and hasn't been brought to justice yet, and it took years and years. So the thing that I've been looking at more recently is the Internal Revenue Service. And this is a problem that has a burgeoning problem that doesn't just affect the Department of Justice or even the SEC, kind of corporate law enforcement and excesses in rampant bad activity and the kind of lack of accountability. There's a almost wholly lack of accountability in tax enforcement now. The IRS's budget is down about 20% in real dollars since 2010. And this has resulted in a decimation of the IRS. The IRS now has fewer than 10,000 auditors across the entire institution. And that is a lower actual number than any time since 1953, the year that Joseph Stalin died. Eisenhower was president. The economy was a seventh of the size. Hasn't been lower since 10,000 people, since then. And one of the consequences of that, and it has a huge number of consequences. Auditing has fallen dramatically. The auditing of people who make over $10 million is down 52%. One of the perverse consequences is that the auditing of the working poor has fallen much less than the auditing for the wealthy. So today, you're more likely to be audited by the IRS if you make $20,000 than if you make $400,000. The working poor is more likely to be audited than the affluent. And the auditing of the working poor who receive a benefit called the Earned Income Tax Credit. Auditing of the working poor is now a third of the auditing, takes up a third of the auditing of the entirety of what the IRS does. So they're letting the super wealthy go, they're scrutinizing the poor. This mirrors what's happening in our justice system, which, as people understand, disproportionately punishes the poor, disproportionately punishes people of color. So most of you know about mass incarceration, which is largely a state level issue, but also implicates federal crimes as well. But this is not just an issue of, this is the flip side of that issue, which is that we have not just a problem of being overly punitive for the poor, we have a problem of impunity for the rich. I don't think people will be surprised to learn that under Trump, things are getting worse. And what's happening now is we have something of a regulatory strike. As I said, white-collar prosecutions hit a low in January 2019. There's been a 62% drop in SEC penalties, a 72% drop in the DOJ's criminal prosecutions. So what has replaced this? As I said, it's settlements with corporations for money. That's the way we enforce corporate wrongdoing in this country. We have corporations pay money to the government. And this is something that was created in the 1990s. We didn't really have an ability to settle with corporations until the 1990s. They create something called the Deferred Prosecution Agreement. It's an agreement where we say we're going to write up an indictment, we're going to put it in a drawer, don't act badly anymore, we'll really come after you next time. And they don't really like it, and it's created kind of in an ad hoc way. And in the first decade or so, they do about 18 of these. And then since the early 2000s, they've done 440 of them. That's the way we punish companies today. We make them pay money. And I think that if you look at what's happening in America today, if you look at the Mueller investigation, what you're seeing is that he's revealing that there are whole swaths of the economy that are relatively, almost entirely unpoliced. And, I wrote my book about top corporate executives, identifying the really wealthy and powerful within the largest corporations in America. And I think I underestimated the problem. Because if you look at what Mueller is revealing, he's revealing that high-end real estate and corporate and political lobbying and campaign finance are almost entirely unpoliced. So you have real estate, campaign finance, lobbying, corporate America, tax frauds, almost none of it is being policed in America today. So corporate power, as we understand, most people in this room, is at a zenith, politically, economically today. CEO pay is back to far beyond where it was, even in the height right before the financial crisis. Corporate profits are at records. The wealthy are seeing riches that they haven't seen since the Gilded Age. When we talk about inequality in America today, most people talk about wealth or income inequality. I argue that the greatest perquisite of being wealthy in this country is the ability to commit crimes with impunity. And this is not just about punishing people. My argument is that this threatens American democracy. So why? Why did this happen? Well, there was a resource shift away from white-collar crime, particularly the FBI. The FBI is the agency that investigates a lot of our white-collar crime. And they shifted resources away from investigating white-collar crime and other things to investigating terrorism and becoming a kind of international intelligence gathering operation in the wake of 9/11. The Department of Justice experienced a lot of losses and humiliations in court. One of them that people may remember was the first trial of the financial crisis, which was a trial of two Bear Stearns executives, a Wall Street firm named Bear Stearns. The Department of Justice lost that case, and that made them very gun-shy about prosecutions. But the real driver was a backlash driven by the corporate defense bar. Corporations hire white-collar firms, big law firms. They are not just legal advisors, they're also their lobbyists in Washington. And there was a very effective campaign from corporations and the white-collar defense bar as a backlash to the investigations that I alluded to earlier, the Enron-era investigations, Enron, WorldCom, et cetera. They depicted those investigations as outrageous, as out of bounds, as unfair, as criminalizing otherwise aggressive business decisions, as criminalizing capitalism, that the prosecutors were cowboys. And that was an extremely successful campaign. And it was so successful that it didn't just convince people who would otherwise be ostensibly sympathetic to corporations, not just Republicans, but Democrats too. And so people like Lanny Brewer, who was Obama's head of the criminal enforcement in the DOJ, or Mary Jo White, who was Obama's head of the SEC, both of them thought these were excessive prosecutions, and those were wrong. And the thing that they really focused on was the prosecution of a company called Arthur Andersen. Arthur Andersen was an accounting firm. It was one of the great accounting firms of the 20th century. It was regarded as the most ethical and the most principled accounting firm. It was also a serial abettor of accounting fraud in the late 1990s. They had helped fraudsters, names that probably are also lost to history: Boston Chicken, Sunbeam, Waste Management. Waste Management was the biggest SEC fine for accounting fraud up till Enron and WorldCom. Also, Enron and WorldCom, Arthur Andersen's accountants. And they were particularly enmeshed with Enron and particularly involved in the accounting frauds there. And when the Fed started investigating Enron, which was a giant energy trading company in Texas, out of Texas, one of the most respected companies, one of the hottest companies in the 1990s in America. I think it was voted the most respected company in America from Fortune magazine, and it imploded in a giant, spectacular fraud. It was the great fraud of the late 1990s, early 2000s. And when it imploded, the Fed started investigating, and Arthur Andersen got wind of those investigations and destroyed literally tons and tons of documents. In one day, they shredded 2,380 pounds of documents compared to an average of 80 pounds a day. And the feds were so appalled by this that they started investigating them for obstruction of justice. And Arthur Andersen said, "We are willing to settle for money, but we cannot admit that we did anything wrong. That would hurt our business." And the Fed said, DOJ said, "Well, you're going to have to admit you did something wrong this time, because when we settled with you for waste management, you said you weren't going to break the rules anymore, and we said there were going to be real consequences. So this time, there are going to be consequences, and the consequences you have to settle, and you have to say you did something wrong." They said, "We're very sorry, but we can't do that, but we're happy to pay what you want us to pay." They said, "Well, why would you pay this money?" And they said, "Well, that's just a cost of doing business." So this was the Department of Justice under George W. Bush. George W. Bush's family was very close to Enron executives. Enron executives were big figures in the Republican Party. And George W. Bush started getting complaints from political figures, political advisors, and he brought in the Deputy Attorney General, a guy named Larry Thompson, and he brought in the head of the FBI. Head of the FBI was a guy named Robert Mueller. Anybody know that name? And Bush brings him in and sits Mueller and Larry Thompson down and says, what's going on with Enron? And Mueller and Thompson very seriously walked him through the evidence that they had gathered on not just Enron, but all the investigations that they were conducting into corporate America. And to George W. Bush's credit, he said, LT, Bobby, you go forward on that. And they went forward. And these guys were stolid, serious-minded law and order guys. There was used to be a kind of Republican law and order ethos that took prosecuting white-collar criminals seriously because they believed in capitalism. They believed in capital markets. They believed that it needed to be a level playing field and you had to prosecute. Larry Thompson was an African-American guy who'd grown up in segregated Missouri and became a Goldwater Republican throughout the 60s. Very right-wing conservative guy. And he believed that prosecuting white-collar criminals you should do it with the same rigor and seriousness and fairness and aggressiveness as you do street criminals. And that's what the George W. Bush administration did, which was quite amazing. After Anderson was prosecuted successfully. And then, as I say, there was a giant backlash. And they depicted the Arthur Anderson prosecution as unfair. And in fact, they won a trial, but it got overturned at the Supreme Court on something of a technicality. But that did not help in the legal world, did not help. It helped the people who were trying to undermine this prosecution as fundamentally unfair. And what they did, it was a remarkable story. It was a PR victory. What they did was they managed to take Arthur Anderson, the serial abettor of accounting fraud, and change the storyline. And they changed it to, if you prosecute companies, you will put people out of jobs. You'll put people on the street. There will be collateral consequences. And it was an extremely effective argument. They changed the subject. And prosecutors got very wary of prosecuting large companies because they didn't want to put people out of business. In the wake of the financial crisis, prosecutors tried to investigate big banks. The big banks said, don't prosecute us because there will be collateral consequences. It's become known as the too big to jail problem, too big to fail, too big to jail problem. We're so intertwined in the markets that if you prosecute us, the markets will crash, the economy will crash, thousands of people will lose their jobs. And so it has insulated large companies because prosecutors have absorbed this. And I will read you a quote. The Justice Department came under a lot of criticism for indicting Arthur Anderson and putting it out of business. This came in 2005. That was justified criticism. What has happened is that since Arthur Anderson, the Justice Department, to its credit, has focused on the awesome collateral consequences. Hitting the markets, putting people out of work. The collateral consequences of moving against an entire entity criminally. The stigma of that, the reputational hit of that is too severe for most companies to survive. Companies can't survive if they're found guilty of crimes. That's what this person is saying. And so they've turned to what they consider lesser sanction with lesser collateral consequences. We have to settle with companies because we can't prosecute them because that would hurt their reputations. The person who said that was Mary Jo White. She became the SEC chairman under Obama. So by the post-financial crisis period, there was a belief among Republicans and among Democrats who were running the Justice Department, who were in power, establishment figures, that you could not prosecute large companies because you needed to avoid the consequences. And when they shifted away from prosecuting companies toward these settlements, the rest atrophied with it. Prosecuting individuals, focusing on individuals, investigating individuals, that atrophied along with it. So I think what you have to understand is how these settlements work today. How do they arrive at multi-billion-dollar settlements with corporations? We read about them all the time. Wells Fargo, just recently. How do they work? Well, the dirty little secret of corporate law enforcement in this country is that we have outsourced and privatized it. If anybody's reading about Boeing, you understand that Boeing gets to determine whether its planes pass or fail their safety tests. Well, that actually is true writ large throughout the government, throughout regulation and enforcement. And it's particularly true with enforcing the law. When corporations break the law, we have outsourced and privatized those investigations. And who have we outsourced and privatized those to? The corporations themselves. The corporations hire law firms, and law firms, their clients, investigate them for wrongdoing. It's kind of like getting Pablo Escobar to try to determine whether he's a major drug lord and having him hire the biggest law firm in Medellin to investigate the process. Or, if you like, if we had a president of the United States who was accused of colluding with the Russians and he hired, say, Rudy Giuliani's firm to investigate the question. And the answer, you can imagine, is not going to be the answer that gets at the truth or justice. The answer is going to be something else. And those investigations that are conducted by the biggest law firms in the country for the biggest corporations in the country, so we're talking about Latham and Watkins and Covington and all these big prestigious names, they're studiously incurious about culpability at the top. They understand what their assignments are. And so they produce investigations that are very smart. These are very smart people, and they have a lot of resources. These are lucrative businesses. They produce very intelligent, thorough-seeming reports, dazzling in their complexity and their authority, and they produce them to the DOJ. What they are is studiously incurious about culpability at the top. They do not finger the CEO or the chair. They understand that that's not their mandate. And occasionally, the board of directors will say, you can do that. But then they understand that if we do this in this instance, we're going to have a problem with the next client that comes along who doesn't want that. We don't want to develop a reputation as being too aggressive. And so they're very good, but they're not too aggressive. And so they don't get at the real questions. The other thing that is very important to understand about these internal investigations is they are done by law firms, done by partners at law firms, the biggest, most important partners at these law firms. And they sit down and they sit at tables across from federal prosecutors. And they negotiate the settlements. And I already told you that federal prosecutors are, by and large, highly educated, products of elite law schools. They're very dedicated people. The most important thing to understand about prosecutors in the biggest, best offices of the Department of Justice in New York, in Washington, in the Eastern District of Virginia, in LA, a handful of offices. The most important thing to understand about them is that they are future corporate defense lawyers. The Department of Justice today has become a training ground for future defense lawyers. It is not a career for these people. Most of these lawyers are young, bright, they're individually ethical people who are in a very complex system. And after 8 or 9 years, They get a stink about them, that a stink of civil servant, a stink of the shark is not moving, the career is stalling, and they move on. And they move on to take a job at Paul Weiss, at one of the big law firms in America. And then they're defending corporations. So what is their incentive structure? Well, their incentive structure when they're prosecutors is to sit across the table from their future bosses and impress them, as you can imagine. But the way you want to impress them is to be dazzling, to be smart, to be appearing like you're a tough negotiator, but ultimately to be a reasonable person, to not be a cowboy, to not completely discount what the other side is saying. You want to be someone who can be envisioned as not sitting across the table, but sitting at the right hand. And so ultimately, they don't want to be cowboys. And they don't want to prosecute individuals because that makes them cowboys in this culture, in the institutional culture of the Department of Justice. It's very risky. To prosecute an individual, you have to spend years. The individuals will fight. You don't have the incentive structure within the DOJ to spend years in an investigation. To prosecute an individual, you must be willing to go to trial. But trials almost don't exist in this country. In the 1970s, the U.S. attorney did an average of 7 trials a year. The average U.S. attorney did around 7 trials a year. Today, the average U.S. attorney does 0.29 trials a year. And so if the white-collar defendant is willing to go to trial just to get one juror to say no, to say he's not guilty, and the prosecutor is afraid of juries because he or she does not understand how juries work, has not stood in front of a jury and tried to persuade those 12 men and women about something, that they're mercurial, that they don't understand the law the way the lawyer does. You have to have that trial experience. They don't have that trial experience. And the other thing that they have is a deep elite affinity. White-collar criminals are not street criminals. They don't look like street criminals. They look like prosecutors. Goldman Sachs bankers are highly educated, cultured, articulate, thoughtful people. They are PhDs in computer science or physics. They have good taste. They are otherwise honorable people. They donate to charity. An SEC, I uncovered an email in the course of writing my book from an SEC official who was actually bringing a sanction against a Goldman Sachs partner, a young Goldman Sachs partner. And he said the night before they sanctioned this guy civilly, he said, remember, these are good people who've made one bad mistake. Good people who've made one bad mistake. Goldman Sachs partner. Well, how the hell did he know? How the hell did he know that this guy was a good person? Maybe he's not a good person. And maybe this wasn't a mistake. Maybe this was something that was done on purpose. Do you think that they say about a drug dealer, an African-American 20-year-old drug dealer on the corner of Baltimore, that person is a good person who's made one bad mistake? Maybe they should, but they don't. And so there's a completely different attitude. And not only that, was this one time? Well, maybe Goldman Sachs bankers do this all the time. Maybe they do it a lot. And in fact, they do it a lot. So do Wells Fargo bankers. And so do Pfizer executives and BP. When we settle with corporations for money, it's a regime that doesn't hold individuals accountable and also doesn't work. The corporations are recidivists. They break the law over and over and over again. So it's a regime that simply does not work even by their standards. I was reminded of this elite affinity the other day when Judge Ellis was sentencing Paul Manafort and said, "You have lived an otherwise blameless life." Blameless life. Now, Paul Manafort had not been convicted of a crime before. I grant Judge Ellis that, but Paul Manafort's entire career was helping despots, blood-stained despots, burnishing their reputation in the halls of American power, helping people who had literally slaughtered their people and stolen money from their people and exploited them. And Paul Manafort sold them as great Democrats, great reformists. Before that, of course, he was involved as a dirty trickster, political dirty trickster. Whatever you're going to say about Paul Manafort, the adjective that you would not reach for is blameless. He's has lived an ethically deeply tarnished life. But Judge Ellis and the SEC official I was referring to earlier have this elite affinity with white-collar defendants. And they see them in wearing nice suits and having attractive families, and they see them as not possibly criminal. Or if they were criminal, it must have been some terrible mistake. So how do we solve this problem? Well, it's not going to be easy, but I would refocus. You need to have a wholesale change in focus, back to focusing on prosecuting individuals and eschew these settlements with corporations. Only as a last resort, you need to do this. You need to change the way you investigate corporate wrongdoing, focusing on individuals, focusing on low-level individuals. And you see this in the Robert Mueller investigation, and who knows how far it will go. But what you're seeing is he focuses on the low-level individuals, and he gets them to flip. And this is the way everyone understands you need to use to prosecute a white-collar crime. It's the same with a drug cartel. It's the same with a mafia family. You flip the soldiers to get to the capos, to get to the capo di tutti capi. It's the same as in a white-collar crime. And what you cannot do is have the companies investigate themselves and deliver you a report that will help you somehow get to the truth. So they need to hire differently. They need to hire people, break the hold of the elite 5 law schools that they hire from at the Department of Justice in the top offices, and hire diversity. And when I mean diversity, of course, I mean people of color and women, but not just that. I mean hire a diversity of professional experience. So you're getting refugees from corporate law who don't want to go through the revolving door. Mary Jo White, who I mentioned earlier, went from being U.S. Attorney in the Southern District to Debevoise and Plimpton to the head of the SEC, back to Debevoise and Plimpton. Eric Holder went from the Department of Justice to Covington and Burling to be the Attorney General to Covington and Burling. The list goes on and on. What you need to do is get people who don't want to be corporate lawyers anymore, who want to know where the bodies are buried. You could get public interest lawyers, plaintiffs' lawyers. You need to kind of break the hold of this corporate defense lawyer machine. And there needs to be a change in the statutes. The courts have been very hostile to white-collar prosecutions. This is not an easy job that prosecutors have, and I have great sympathy for them, and the courts have gotten much more hostile particularly to white-collar prosecutions. The Supreme Court has made a number of rulings that have been made their job even harder than it is, and it's already hard because, of course, white-collar criminals, often the most powerful, have great resources to defend themselves. So there needs to be a concerted effort to analyze where the statutes are faltering and go to Congress and demand better laws. It's not going to happen with this Senate, but it may happen eventually. So again, why does this matter? Well, I alluded to this earlier, that if you have a profoundly unfair system, if you have a system where the rule of law seems to only apply to the few and not to all, it destroys the legitimacy of our system. It destroys the legitimacy of our justice system. And that, in turn, is a deep threat to democracy. And you can see this with the American people. Donald Trump ran against Wall Street in his campaign. And Hillary Clinton actually said that she was going to put more white-collar criminals in prison. And nobody believed her. Partly nobody believed her because she had given all those high-paid speeches to Wall Street. Nobody thought that she was going to go through with that. So Donald Trump said, you can't believe Hillary Clinton. You can believe me. I'm a rich person. I'm independent. I'm not going to be beholden to Goldman Sachs. So what he did when he got into office was install Goldman Sachs bankers as his closest advisors, and to take the pedal off the very weak Obama pedal of enforcement. He lifted even that. And so we have an even worse situation today than we did then. It's getting worse. And I think that people understand that it is fundamentally unfair and that we are facing a grave threat to the legitimacy of our system. And with that, I will take questions.
Thank you. We do have time for a few questions, so I'll man the mic and move it around here if anybody has questions they want to ask.
You talked about legislation at the end, and I remember, of course, after the financial collapse, we had Dodd-Frank.
Yeah.
I'm curious of your take on that. It doesn't sound like it did any good. Was that focused at all on enforcement and these white-collar criminals, or was it not focused on that?
It was, it gave some enforcement, added enforcement power. So Dodd-Frank's a mixed bag. Dodd-Frank was a law that touched every corner of the financial world and had some real accomplishments. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau was a major accomplishment. It's a creation, the brainchild of Elizabeth Warren. It's created by that law. And it's the first regulator that has any mandate to actually focus on consumers of financial products. That's a great accomplishment. Now, under the Trump administration and Mick Mulvaney and Mick Mulvaney's predecessor, it is being eviscerated. I've written a story about that. It was literally Mulvaney's first act when he became acting CFPB director was to freeze every investigation that was going on for computer security, so they couldn't actually get into their computers to do their jobs for months. So Dodd-Frank is a mixed bag. The banks are slightly safer than they were because it called for an increase in capital requirements. It has been very slow to be implemented. And the fundamental problem with Dodd-Frank was that it did not change the architecture of our financial regulation system or the architecture and structure of our banks. And so the problem, so, there are a lot of possible solutions like Glass-Steagall or some kind of updated version of Glass-Steagall where you separate certain kinds of business lines. Glass-Steagall separated investment banking from commercial banking. But what happened was Dodd-Frank was vulnerable to being completely reversed by an administration that's hostile to its aims. And that's what's happening now. So the capital requirements are being rolled back. The mortgage rules are being rolled back. The CFPB's payday lender regulations are being rolled back. And so Dodd-Frank was fundamentally vulnerable because it was structured the wrong way, I think.
Yes, I think in the last day or two, the New York Times had extensive coverage on Deutsche Bank and apparently some of its activities. Is there any reason to hope that if that gets a lot of publicity and it's being investigated by various Senate committees, that may have a good end?
Well, I don't know about reason to hope, but the Democrats being in control of the House is hugely consequential for if they understand their responsibilities for oversight, which is a constitutionally mandated responsibility that they must do if they are to be responsible stewards, responsible political leaders. And they do show glimmers of it. So they are investigating Deutsche Bank. And the real question with Deutsche Bank is, there are many questions with Deutsche Bank, but one of them is, where did the money eventually, ultimately come from that funded Donald Trump's loans, and how did Donald Trump pay those loans back? I think that's a big question. A lot of people have wondered if that came from money launderers or Russia or something like that. I think that's an outstanding question that we don't know the answer to. The House could investigate that. So there's a lot of room for oversight, and that's going to happen. There are also an enormous number of investigations of Trump ongoing, even beyond the Mueller investigation, as everybody in this room understands. The Southern District of New York, which I was writing about, is investigating the Trump Organization and Donald Trump in a variety of things. One, the inauguration, and two, the Trump Organization's business, which my view is that the Trump Organization could not withstand 23 minutes of sustained prosecutorial inquiry without revelations of serious wrongdoing if those prosecutors have their eyes open. And so we will see what will happen as they continue to do those investigations. So far, the Southern District seems to be free of political interference and doing a significant job. So you've got the House investigations, which are serious. You've got the Southern District, which is serious. We have the Mueller report, which is a serious professional investigation. We'll see what comes of it. We don't know.
You got through the whole presentation, which was excellent, without mentioning the role of social media. And one observation I had when you were talking was that prior to Enron and in the 90s, you didn't really have this proliferation of databases which can manipulate and reports which can manipulate public opinion on such a scale. And public pressure can do a whole lot to change the dynamic. Could you comment on social media and whether that has in any way contributed to the problems that we're seeing right now?
That's a very good question. I haven't really thought about this specific question of, has social media contributed to our lack of ability to investigate and prosecute the most powerful? My inclination would be, on that score, no, that this is really an inside game that happens in the halls of Washington rather than an outside public opinion game. Now, the other question the implications of your question are, is social media distorting our politics? Is social media unpoliced? Is Facebook a company that is too powerful and a recidivist organization? Facebook is under FTC consent decree and has, by any reasonable measure, violated that consent decree multiple times. So what will the consequences be? In that question, which is not exactly your question, which is, are these tech companies willfully abusing the law, and can they be held to account? That's a question I'm very pessimistic about. I see them as way too powerful and having captured both the Republican and Democratic parties, especially the establishments of both those parties. So we'll see. But as for whether social media and kind of the fervor has deprived prosecutors of the ability to prosecute. I don't see that.
After Enron and and then you had the real estate crash, and it seemed like a very good moment for reform to carry through, but it didn't happen. Why do you think that was?
So Enron is the early 2000s, and then and there's a reform, but it's a modest reform called Sarbanes-Oxley. And then were you also asking about the financial crisis and 2008? So I'll address that. So my analysis of why greater reform doesn't happen under the Obama administration is that the Obama administration is a highly professional, elite group of technocrats. And they view things like prosecutions and Glass-Steagall as, frankly, stupid, dumb, simplistic. Tim Geithner says we're not going to do Old Testament justice. And what that means to them, I think, is that's unsophisticated. You prosecute one or two bad apples, you haven't done anything to fix the system. You're just simple-minded torch carriers who are calling for a couple of kangaroo trials. We're going to do something much more intelligent. We're going to do Dodd-Frank. And we are smarter than you, definitely. Tim Geithner thinks he's the smartest. And he thinks, we can tailor our rules to anticipate every eventuality of wrongdoing. So we're going to write mortgage rules, and it's going to take us a few years, like 4 or 5 years, because we're going to write a rule for every single type of mortgage that anyone can imagine and exactly how it works, because we're great, brilliant technocrats. So we're going to do a lot of tinkering instead of dumb rules like splitting commercial banking from investment banking. That's really crude. So the Obama administration thinks it's smarter than everybody else, and they outsmarted themselves. That's what happened. And prosecutions were a part of that because they thought they were the wrong way to do it. And my argument is you need both. You need systemic reform, and you need to couple it with prosecuting and holding people accountable because they lend legitimacy and work together. You say, we punish those people, and they did bad things, and this is why we need to change the system. And because you can point to, that guy did something bad, and that's outrageous, and we held him accountable, that we need to fix that problem, and we could make our systemic reform better and stronger and more sensible because of it. So in fact, they work together.
When advocating for change or for reform like this, how do you deal with the inevitable pushback that seems to come from powerful places? For example, in this case, being labeled as an anti-capitalist, or in the case of gun reform, of simple reforms being completely, they're coming to take all your guns.
Right.
How do you deal with this pushback in order to accomplish that change, to get sort of a common appeal to actually make some real change?
Well, so I'm going to slightly have a cop-out answer, which is I'm not an advocate, and I don't push for change. I'm a journalist, and so I'm identifying problems and proposing some solutions. But that's sort of the limit of what I see I'm kind of professionally either obligated or allowed to do. And whether there's any momentum from my book, that would be nice. It hasn't happened. I have not changed the American judicial system yet. But if I do enough talks at universities and shape young minds, so I basically see myself as almost entirely powerless and uninfluential. The sad thing is that I clearly haven't been dangerous enough because I get invited by, law firms to talk. and like accounting firms. I give my speech and they come up and they say, oh, I liked all those stories and I knew those guys. I worked with those guys. That was a lot of fun to read those stories. And so I sort of think, well, where did I go wrong? Because you think that I'm just amusing. So, capitalism has a great ability to absorb its critiques. And this is a small one that I'm offering. And so I see it as slightly hopeless, but I enjoy it anyway.
All right. So you talked about prosecution and legislation. Outside of that, what do you recommend in terms of from a bottom-up approach of addressing the way individual actors act or behave, like, whether it's corporate leaders or lawyers? How, maybe should we teach more ethics, or what do you recommend?
God, no, I don't believe in teaching ethics. We've had decades of ethics teaching in great universities, and it has completely failed. I think what we need is a series of political reforms that takes power away from a tiny elite who have the wealth and power to distort our political system. And so that can come in a variety of ways. One of the ways that I understand the best and that I'm writing about is punishing them when they are criminals. I'm not talking about kangaroo trials. I'm not talking about unjustified prosecutions. I'm talking about basically prosecutorial discretion. If you talk to prosecutors, you understand that the great tool that they have, the most serious responsibility that they have is prosecutorial discretion. And it means on an individual case, should we bring this case? Is this the right thing to bring? Do we have enough proof beyond a reasonable doubt? Or are we abusing our great powers? And the power of prosecution is an awesome power, even when brought to bear on a wealthy and powerful person. And so what I'm arguing for is focus on it a little bit more and punish the powerful when it's warranted and try to investigate them. There are a whole host of things that you could envision that we need to do outside of that. Enforce the tax laws, audit the wealthy, bring enough resources to bear so that when you audit the wealthy, you can find the way that they're cheating on their taxes, because they do cheat. That's where the cheating is, actually. That's certainly where the money is. Audit corporations. Every corporation in America, every large corporation in America was audited every single year 10 years ago. 100% of corporations, actually more than 100%, because many companies were going under multiple audits for multiple years at the time. Now that is under half, under 50%. Only fewer than 50% of the largest companies in America are audited every year. So audit them, which means fund the IRS. The IRS has had huge cuts. So those are two of the things that I'm closest to.
We've got two more questions here.
Since we're in the auditorium or the center of a former governor and former senator, let's talk about the elephant in the room. We have a former governor here in the state of Florida that was the CEO of Columbia HCA. He was prosecuted for the largest Medicare, Medicaid fraud penalty ever at the time. Under deposition, he pled the Fifth Amendment, 75 times, and he's gone on to be elected our United States Senator. Any comment or insight on Senator Rick Scott?
Ain't America great? I don't know enough about the details of the case. So there were prosecutions of that powerful that aren't successful sometimes, and Richard Scrushy, who was sort of a competitor to Rick Scott, was prosecuted, and then they failed to prosecute them and successfully. And I think that's important to fail. Occasionally, you have to take on the powerful, and you'll lose. The whole point of Jim Comey's speech is that occasionally you have to take on the powerful and be willing to lose and willing to take that risk. So, once you prosecute the wealthy and powerful and you've been unsuccessful, they have the ability to go on to great things, like be elected to governor of the great state of Florida. So that's up to the, it's up to the Floridians and the American people to hold them accountable.
Last question.
Hi. I'll apologize in advance. I'm definitely not very well versed in economics, but as far as I understand, the United States being a fiat economy is completely based on securities. And at the beginning of your discussion, you started by saying that there's this narrative that if you take down the big people, then what's going to happen to the little person? Are they going to suffer these collateral consequences? I want to know what your opinion is regarding that, especially considering the very end of the discussion where you talked about the legitimacy of the system. How can one decide what the legitimacy of the system is? Does it not lie on the little people, the ones that actually suffer the consequences?
So if I understand what your question is, what are you asking me, if you punish the powerful, it will hurt the less powerful, and so shouldn't prosecutors have some sense of responsibility for what those actions are? Is that your question? Something like that? Well, I basically think that prosecutors should not be thinking about the economic consequences of their actions. When you prosecute a murderer and put a murderer in prison, that you might be depriving that family of a breadwinner. And that will hurt that man's children if that murderer was a man. That's not the prosecutor's job. So we have other people who need to secure the economy. We have economic policymakers and advisors and the Federal Reserve, and we have the Council of Economic Advisors. So the job of prosecutors is to identify what laws are being broken and prosecute them fairly and without fear or favor, and prosecuting the most powerful if the most powerful are doing something wrong. So when I talk about the legitimacy of the system being corroded, I think that if you walk into a bar in any town in America and say, what happened in the financial crisis, the one thing that anyone will be able to say to you is nobody went to jail. Nobody went to prison. That's what everybody understands. And that is corrosive. That is wrong. They understand it fundamentally. They understand it much better than Tim Geithner understands how profoundly unfair that is. The financial crisis immiserated millions. It threw people out of their homes and their jobs. And to have no accountability for that, to hold no one individually responsible for that, it just destroys people's faith in America. And you can see that in our politics today.
As I noted, we do have some of Jesse's books for sale over in the back left over here, and obviously you'll be available as well.
All right. Thank you. Thanks very much. Good. Thank you.
Thanks. That was great.
Oh, thank you.